The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban streets. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made life feel simple and predictable, until it wasn't. Emily, a small girl with curly blonde hair tied neatly into pigtails, walked home from school alone. She lived just 3 blocks away, a route she had memorized since kindergarten. Her backpack bounced against her back with each step, its weight filled not only with books, but also with things she didn't want to think about. The harsh words whispered behind her in class, the laughter that followed her down the hallway. At 10 years old, Emily already knew what it felt like to be invisible to some and a target to others. But today, something inside her snapped. At home, her mother sat at the kitchen table, her phone pressed to her ear as she juggled work calls. Papers were scattered around her, coffee growing cold in a mug nearby. She barely noticed when Emily left for school earlier that day or how unusually quiet her daughter had been lately. Work deadlines loomed large over everything else, leaving little room for noticing cracks forming beneath the surface of their relationship. Meanwhile, Marcus pulled his garbage truck onto the street, ready to start his daily rounds. He wore his usual uniform, a bright orange vest over a plain blue t-shirt, and carried gloves worn soft by years of hard labor. To most people, he was just the garbage man, someone whose name they didn't bother learning. But those who took the time to know him saw a different side. Marcus always greeted everyone with a warm smile, asking how their week was going or complimenting their garden. Kids loved him because he tossed them candy on holidays, and older folks appreciated his polite nods and friendly waves. Still, there were moments when he caught glimpses of judgmental stares, reminders that no matter how kind he was, some barriers were harder to break. As Marcus worked, lifting bins and emptying them into the truck, he hummed an old tune to himself. It was comforting, rhythmic work that allowed his mind to wander. Sometimes he thought about his own childhood, growing up in a neighborhood much like this one, where dreams often felt out of reach. Other times, he reflected on the lives unfolding behind these doors, the joys, struggles, secrets hidden behind drawn curtains. Each house told a story, whether its owners realized it or not. Unbeknownst to either Emily or Marcus, their paths were about to cross in a way neither could have anticipated. The calm rhythm of the morning seemed ordinary enough, yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. For Emily, the weight of loneliness pressed heavier with each passing day. And for Marcus, the subtle sting of being overlooked lingered despite his best efforts to connect. Little did they know, their meeting would ripple through the neighborhood, sparking conversations and challenging assumptions in ways no one expected. But for now, the world moved forward as it always did, one step, one breath, one moment at a time. As Emily turned the corner onto her street, her small shoulders sagged under the weight of emotion she couldn't quite put into words. The teasing at school had been relentless that day, whispers about her hand-me-down clothes, snickers when she raised her hand to answer a question, and cruel jokes scribbled on scraps of paper slipped onto her desk. She tried to hold it together, but by the time she reached the familiar sidewalk lined with neatly trimmed hedges, tears began spilling down her cheeks. Her chest tightened, and sobs escaped before she could stop them. Looking around, Emily realized she was alone. There were no friendly faces, no one who might offer comfort or even ask if she was okay. Then, through her blurry vision, she spotted Marcus. He stood near his garbage truck, lifting a heavy trash bin with practiced ease. His bright orange vest caught the sunlight, making him stand out against the muted tones of the autumn morning. To Emily, he seemed like a lifeline in an ocean of loneliness. Without thinking twice, she ran toward him, clutching her backpack straps as though they might anchor her to something solid. Startled by the sudden appearance of a crying child, Marcus set the bin down carefully and turned to face her. Kneeling slightly so he could meet her eye level, he softened his voice. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" His tone wasn't patronizing or rushed. It was genuine, filled with concern. For Emily, it felt like the first kind words she'd heard all day. At first, she struggled to speak, choking back sobs as tears streamed down her face. But slowly, haltingly, she began to talk. She told him about the kids at school who made fun of her, calling her names she didn't understand. She talked about how hard it was to concentrate in class when everyone seemed to be laughing at her. And then, almost in a whisper, she admitted that sometimes she felt invisible, not just at school, but at home too. Her mom was always busy, always distracted, leaving Emily to navigate her feelings on her own. Marcus listened intently, nodding occasionally to show he understood. He didn't interrupt or try to fix things right away. Instead, he let her pour out her heart. When she finally paused, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater, he offered her a tissue from his pocket. "You're not invisible, Emily," he said firmly but kindly. "Not to me. You're strong, braver than you think, and you deserve better than what those kids are giving you." For a moment, Emily felt seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. The knot in her chest loosened slightly, replaced by a flicker of hope. She managed a weak smile, clutching the tissue tightly in her hand. But their tender interaction was short-lived. Unbeknownst to either of them, someone else had been watching. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor known for her sharp tongue and nosy demeanor, peered through her living room curtains. She saw Emily run up to Marcus and watched as he knelt beside her. To Mrs. Henderson, the scene looked suspicious. A grown man talking closely to a young girl, her face streaked with tears. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, fueled by years of ingrained biases he barely acknowledged. Without hesitation, she picked up her phone and dialed 911, reporting what she believed to be a dangerous situation unfolding outside her window. Back on the sidewalk, Marcus noticed Emily glancing nervously over her shoulder. Following her gaze, he saw flashing red and blue lights approaching rapidly. Panic surged within him as police cars screeched to a halt along the curb, officers stepping out with serious expressions. In that instant, Marcus realized this quiet morning was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would challenge not only him, but also the entire neighborhood. The calm rhythm of the day shattered, replaced by chaos and uncertainty. Yet amidst the commotion, one thing remained clear: Emily still clung to Marcus, unwilling to let go despite the rising tension around them. Whatever happened next, their connection had already sparked something powerful, a moment of humanity that refused to be ignored. The sound of screeching tires and flashing red and blue lights shattered the quiet morning. Neighbors who had been going about their usual routines, watering plants, walking dogs, or sipping coffee on porches, paused mid-motion, their attention instantly drawn to the unfolding scene. Officers spilled out of their vehicles, their movements brisk and purposeful, as they surrounded Marcus and Emily. The once peaceful street transformed into a stage for chaos, with Marcus at its center. Mrs. Henderson, standing behind her lace curtains, watched with a mix of satisfaction and unease. She told herself she'd done the right thing by calling 911. After all, wasn't it better to be safe than sorry? But as she saw Emily clinging tightly to Marcus, her small arms wrapped around his arm, as if afraid he might disappear, doubt flickered in her mind. Still, she pushed it aside, convincing herself that appearances could be deceiving. Across the street, other neighbors began to gather, their curiosity outweighing any hesitation. Some whispered among themselves, their voices hushed but urgent. "What's going on?" one man asked, craning his neck to see past the growing crowd. A woman nearby shrugged, clutching her dog's leash tighter. "I don't know, but it looks serious." Others exchanged knowing glances, silently piecing together their own versions of events based on what little they could see. Not everyone reacted with suspicion, though. Mr. Patel, who owned the corner store, stepped forward from his spot near the curb. He'd known Marcus for years, often chatting with him during garbage pickups. "That's Marcus," he said firmly to anyone within earshot. He's a good man. I've never seen him cause trouble." His words carried weight, but not everyone listened. Old prejudices simmered beneath the surface, bubbling up now that uncertainty filled the air. Emily's tears returned, this time born of fear rather than sadness. She clung to Marcus even tighter, her small frame trembling as officers approached. One officer, a tall man with a stern expression, raised his hand toward Marcus. "Step away from the child," he commanded, his voice loud enough to carry over the murmurs of the crowd. Marcus froze, his heart pounding. He wanted to explain, to assure them that he'd only been helping Emily, but the intensity of the situation left him momentarily speechless. Another officer, a younger woman with a softer tone, knelt beside Emily. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked gently, trying to make eye contact. Emily nodded hesitantly but didn't let go of Marcus. Her grip was firm, almost protective, as if she feared they would take him away. "He helped me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the commotion. The officer exchanged a glance with her partner, unsure how to proceed. Meanwhile, Marcus raised his hand slowly, palms open, to show he meant no harm. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said calmly, though his voice carried an edge of frustration. "She came to me upset. I was just trying to help." His words hung in the air, met with silence from the officers and skeptical stares from some onlookers. For every person willing to believe him, there seemed to be another ready to doubt. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding them from the scene while casting wary glances at Marcus. Teenagers filmed the incident on their phones, already crafting narratives to share online without knowing the full story. Even the usually cheerful chirping of birds overhead seemed muted, drowned out by the hum of murmured speculation and the occasional bark of authority. Amidst the confusion, Mrs. Henderson retreated further behind her curtains, suddenly uneasy about the consequences of her call. She hadn't imagined this level of response. Police cars, flashing lights, a crowd gathering like moths to a flame. What if she misjudged the situation? What if Marcus really was innocent? These questions gnawed at her, but pride kept her rooted where she stood. Admitting she might have made a mistake felt impossible. As the moments stretched on, the neighborhood held its breath. No one knew how this would end, but everyone sensed that something significant was happening, something that would ripple far beyond this single street. For now, all eyes remained fixed on Marcus and Emily, two strangers brought together by chance, whose lives were about to intersect in ways neither could have anticipated. The street buzzed with tension as the officers tried to untangle the truth from the chaos. Marcus stood frozen, his hand still raised in surrender, while Emily clung to him like a lifeline. Her small frame trembled against his side, her fingers gripping his arm so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The crowd of neighbors grew larger by the minute, their whispers weaving a tapestry of assumptions and half-truths. Some leaned forward eagerly, hungry for drama. Others hung back, unsure what to believe. One officer, Officer Daniels, stepped closer to Marcus, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. His voice was firm but controlled. "Sir, I need you to step away from the child now," he repeated, his eyes scanning Marcus's face for any sign of guilt or defiance. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry, but he didn't move. Instead, he glanced down at Emily, whose tear-streaked face looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes. "Please don't leave me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "I'm not leaving you," Marcus reassured her softly before addressing the officer again. "I swear, I didn't do anything wrong. She came to me upset, and I was just trying to help." His words were steady, but there was an undercurrent of frustration in his tone. He knew how this looked, how it always looked when someone like him found himself in a situation like this. It wasn't the first time people had doubted his intentions simply because of the color of his skin, but it never got easier. Officer Reynolds, the younger woman who had knelt beside Emily earlier, approached cautiously. She placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, her expression softening. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what happened?" she asked, her voice calm and reassuring. Emily hesitated, glancing between Marcus and the officer. Then, taking a deep breath, she spoke up. "He helped me," she said, louder this time, her voice trembling but determined. "I was sad, and he talked to me and made me feel better." The officer nodded slowly, processing Emily's words. She turned to her partner, exchanging a meaningful look. For a moment, the air seemed less charged, as if Emily's explanation might shift the tide. But skepticism lingered among the crowd, and even among some of the officers. One man in uniform barked into his radio, requesting backup, while another began questioning bystanders about what they'd seen. Mrs. Henderson, still peeking through her curtains, shrank further into the shadows, guilt gnawing at her conscience. Meanwhile, Marcus felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. Some stares were curious, others accusatory, and a few, like Mr. Patel's, were sympathetic. A teenager filming the scene zoomed in on Marcus's face, capturing his frustration and exhaustion. Someone muttered, "You never know these days," loud enough for those nearby to hear. Marcus clenched his jaw, biting back the urge to defend himself more forcefully. He knew arguing wouldn't help. Experience had taught him that staying calm was his best chance at proving his innocence. As the minutes dragged on, the crowd grew restless. Parents ushered their children inside, casting wary glances over their shoulders. Others lingered, unwilling to miss a moment of the spectacle. An older woman shook her head disapprovingly, muttering something about strangers and kids these days. A young father crossed his arms, glaring at Marcus as though daring him to make a wrong move. Each reaction added another layer of pressure to an already suffocating situation. Despite the mounting tension, Marcus refused to let anger take hold. Instead, he focused on Emily, speaking softly to keep her calm. "It's going to be okay," he told her, his voice steady despite the storm swirling around them. "These nice officers are just trying to figure out what happened." Emily nodded, though her grip on his arm didn't loosen. To her, Marcus wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was the person who had listened when no one else did, who had offered kindness when she needed it most. Finally, after what felt like hours, Officer Reynolds stood and addressed her colleagues. "Let's get statements from both of them separately," she suggested, her tone firm but fair. Reluctantly, Officer Daniels agreed, motioning for Marcus to step aside. Emily whimpered, reaching out instinctively as Marcus moved away. "It's okay," he reassured her once more, forcing a smile despite the heaviness in his chest. As the officers led him to the side of the road, the crowd began to murmur again, speculating about what would happen next. For Marcus, the ordeal was far from over. But as he glanced back at Emily, still standing bravely amidst the chaos, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would shine brighter than the doubts clouding the minds of those around them. As the officers separated Marcus and Emily to take their statements, the tension in the air remained thick, but a shift began to occur. Officer Reynolds crouched beside Emily, her demeanor calm and patient. "Can you tell me everything that happened, sweetheart?" she asked gently, giving the young girl space to speak without feeling pressured. Emily hesitated for a moment, glancing toward Marcus, who stood a few feet away with another officer. His presence reassured her, even from a distance. Taking a deep breath, Emily recounted the events of the morning. The teasing at school, the loneliness she felt walking home, and how she had run to Marcus when her emotions overwhelmed her. Her voice wavered as she described how he had knelt down to comfort her, listened to her story, and offered words of encouragement. "He didn't do anything bad," Emily insisted, her tone firm despite her tears. "He made me feel better when no one else did." Officer Reynolds nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes as Emily spoke. She could see the sincerity in the girl's eyes and hear it in her voice. Turning to her partner, she relayed what Emily had said, emphasizing the child's insistence that Marcus had been kind and supportive. Meanwhile, Marcus gave his own account to Officer Daniels, explaining how Emily had approached him crying and how he'd simply tried to console her. He answered each question honestly, maintaining eye contact and speaking clearly, though the weight of judgment still lingered in the atmosphere. While the officers worked to piece together the truth, the crowd began to thin slightly. Some neighbors returned to their homes, their curiosity satisfied for now, while others lingered, unwilling to leave until they saw a resolution. Among them was Mrs. Henderson, who watched nervously from her porch, guilt gnawing at her conscience. She hadn't expected things to escalate this far, and seeing Emily defend Marcus so passionately left her unsettled. For the first time, she questioned whether her call to 911 had been premature, or worse, misguided. The commotion drew more attention than anyone anticipated, including Emily's mother, Sarah. At home, she had finally wrapped up her work call when a neighbor knocked on her door, informing her about the scene unfolding outside. Panic surged through Sarah as she rushed out, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When she arrived, she pushed through the remaining bystanders, her heart sinking as she spotted Emily standing near the police car, her face streaked with tears. "Emily," Sarah called out, rushing to her daughter's side. She dropped to her knees, pulling Emily into a tight embrace. "Are you okay? What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. Emily buried her face in her mother's shoulder, letting out a shaky sob. Between sniffles, she explained how she had been upset and sought comfort from Marcus, only for the police to arrive unexpectedly. Sarah listened intently, her gaze shifting between her daughter and Marcus, who stood nearby under the watchful eyes of the officers. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Sarah approached the officers cautiously. "I'm her mother," she said, her voice steadied despite her racing thoughts. "Can someone please explain what's going on?" Officer Reynolds summarized the events, highlighting Emily's testimony and Marcus's cooperation throughout. As Sarah processed the information, she noticed the exhaustion etched on Marcus's face and the way Emily continued to look at him with trust and gratitude. A wave of shame washed over her. She hadn't been there for her daughter when she needed her most, yet a stranger had stepped in without hesitation. Determined to set things right, Sarah turned to address the gathered crowd. "This man helped my daughter when she was hurting," she announced, her voice clear and unwavering. "He didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal." Her words hung in the air, silencing the murmurs around her. Some neighbors nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, their earlier suspicions beginning to fade. Even Mrs. Henderson looked away, unable to meet Sarah's gaze. With both Emily and Sarah vouching for Marcus, the officers concluded their investigation quickly. After verifying his credentials and confirming his alibi with his supervisor, they officially cleared him of any wrongdoing. The relief on Marcus's face was palpable, though the ordeal had taken its toll. As the officers packed up and prepared to leave, Sarah walked over to Marcus, extending her hand. "Thank you for being there for my daughter," she said sincerely. "I'm sorry for everything you've gone through because of this." Marcus accepted her handshake, offering a small, weary smile. "I just wanted to help," he replied simply. Behind them, Emily ran forward, throwing her arms around Marcus in a grateful hug. In that moment, surrounded by lingering whispers and fading chaos, the days following the incident brought a mix of emotions for everyone involved. For Marcus, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the weight of what had happened lingered. He went back to his garbage route, lifting bins and exchanging polite greetings with neighbors, though some avoided meeting his eyes. Others, however, made an effort to acknowledge him. A wave here, a thank you there. It was small, but it mattered. Marcus knew that while not everyone in the neighborhood saw him differently, at least some did. Emily's world also began to shift in subtle yet meaningful ways. Her mother, Sarah, couldn't shake the image of her daughter clinging to Marcus, tears streaming down her face as she defended him. That moment forced Sarah to confront how disconnected she'd become from Emily's life. Work deadlines and endless calls had blinded her to the struggles her daughter faced daily: bullying at school, feelings of invisibility, and a longing for connection. Determined to make amends, Sarah started setting aside time each evening just for Emily. They baked cookies together, played board games, and talked about everything from school projects to favorite TV shows. Slowly, the cracks in their relationship began to mend. One evening, Sarah decided to visit Marcus personally. She wanted to apologize, not just for the misunderstanding on the street, but for the broader assumptions that had fueled it. With Emily by her side, they walked to Marcus's modest home after his shift ended. The house was simple, with potted plants lining the porch and a welcome mat at the door. When Marcus opened the door, he looked surprised but welcomed them warmly. "I wanted to say thank you," Sarah began, her voice steady but sincere. "You were there for my daughter when I wasn't, and I'm so sorry for what happened because of it." She hesitated, glancing at Emily before continuing. "I know people judged you unfairly, and that shouldn't have happened. You didn't deserve any of it." Marcus nodded slowly, appreciating the gesture more than words could convey. "It's okay," he said finally, his voice calm. "I understand why people reacted the way they did, but I hope this can be a chance for everyone to think twice, to see past what someone looks like or what job they do and focus on who they really are." The conversation deepened as they sat together in Marcus's living room. Over cups of tea, they discussed the challenges of trust, prejudice, and the importance of seeing people beyond surface-level differences. Emily chimed in occasionally, sharing how much Marcus's kindness meant to her. "You're my hero," she declared shyly, earning a chuckle from Marcus. That visit marked the beginning of a new friendship. Marcus became something of a mentor to Emily, offering advice whenever she needed it. He shared stories about growing up in a similar neighborhood, facing his own share of hardships, but finding strength in community and resilience. His words inspired Emily to stand up to her bullies, teaching her that being different wasn't something to hide. It was something to embrace. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood itself began to change too. Conversations sparked among residents about the incident, prompting reflections on bias and empathy. Some neighbors organized informal gatherings to discuss these issues openly. At one such meeting, Mr. Patel spoke passionately about knowing Marcus for years and vouching for his character. Mrs. Henderson attended quietly, listening intently as others shared their thoughts. Though she didn't speak up, her presence signaled a willingness to listen and learn. Small acts of kindness rippled through the community. Neighbors who once ignored Marcus now greeted him warmly, thanking him for his hard work. Kids waved enthusiastically as his truck passed by, and even Mrs. Henderson left a note on his windshield one morning. "Thank you for all you do. It wasn't perfect." Some attitudes remained unchanged, but progress felt tangible. For Emily, the transformation was profound. With her mother's renewed support and Marcus's guidance, she found her voice. She stood taller in class, no longer shrinking under the weight of cruel jokes. When bullies tried to tease her, she responded confidently, surprising even herself. Her classmates noticed the change, and gradually, the teasing stopped altogether. As the seasons shifted, the neighborhood grew quieter again, returning to its peaceful routines. But beneath the surface, seeds of understanding and compassion had been planted. Marcus continued his work, smiling at every passerby, while Emily flourished under the care of those who truly saw her. Together, they reminded everyone around them of a powerful truth. Sometimes, moments of crisis reveal not only our flaws, but also our capacity for growth and for love. The incident on the quiet suburban street didn't fade into obscurity as some might have expected. Instead, it became a catalyst for larger conversations that rippled far beyond the neighborhood. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as both a cautionary tale and an opportunity for reflection. Headlines like "Garbage Man Cleared After Heartfelt Encounter with Crying Child" and "Community Grapples with Bias After Misunderstanding Turns Ugly" drew attention not just to Marcus and Emily, but also to the broader issues of prejudice, empathy, and trust. Television crews visited the neighborhood, setting up cameras near Marcus's usual route. Reporters interviewed residents, asking questions that made some squirm uncomfortably. Do you think this could have been avoided? Or how do we address implicit bias in our communities? Some neighbors spoke candidly about their initial suspicions and admitted they had misjudged Marcus. Others defended him passionately, highlighting his years of service and kindness. Mrs. Henderson, though hesitant at first, eventually agreed to speak off-camera. She confessed her role in calling 911 and expressed regret for jumping to conclusions. Her admission was raw and honest, resonating with viewers who recognized similar biases within themselves. Social media amplified the discussion even further. Videos of the scene went viral, sparking debates across platforms. Some commenters praised Marcus for his grace under pressure, while others criticized the system that allowed such misunderstandings to escalate so quickly. A #SeathPerson, not only trended locally but gained traction nationwide, encouraging people to share stories of overcoming stereotypes and finding common ground. Teachers used the incident as a teaching moment in classrooms, discussing the importance of looking beyond appearances and assumptions. Back in the neighborhood, inspired by the growing dialogue, a group of residents decided to take action. They organized a community meeting at the local library, inviting Marcus to attend. Though he initially hesitated, unsure if he wanted to relive the experience, he ultimately agreed. The room was packed with familiar faces, parents, teachers, business owners, all eager to listen and learn. Marcus shared his perspective openly, speaking not just about the day of the incident, but also about the everyday challenges faced by essential workers like him. "We're more than our uniforms," he said, his voice steady yet heartfelt. "We're people, just like anyone else." His words struck a chord. Following the meeting, several initiatives were launched to foster better relationships between residents and those who serve the community daily. A Thank You Thursday campaign encouraged neighbors to express gratitude to postal workers, delivery drivers, and sanitation staff. Kids created handmade cards and handed them out along with bottles of cold water during hot summer days. Even small gestures, like waving hello or learning someone's name, began to feel monumental in bridging gaps that had long existed unnoticed. Not everyone embraced the changes, of course. Some remained resistant, clinging to old beliefs and dismissing efforts toward inclusivity as unnecessary or performative. But the majority leaned into the momentum, recognizing that progress often required uncomfortable conversations and deliberate actions. Slowly, the neighborhood transformed, not overnight, but in ways that felt sustainable and genuine. For Emily, the ripple effects were deeply personal. She became more outspoken, sharing her story at school assemblies and community events. Her courage inspired other children to open up about their own struggles with bullying or loneliness. Teachers noticed a shift in classroom dynamics, with students becoming kinder and more supportive of one another. Emily even started a kindness club, where kids brainstormed ways to make their peers feel valued and included. Marcus watched these developments with quiet pride. He hadn't sought recognition or praise, but seeing the tangible impact of that single morning filled him with hope. One afternoon, as he finished his route, he spotted Emily sitting on her front steps, reading a book. She waved enthusiastically when she saw him, shouting, "Hi, Marcus," before running over to give him a hug. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed lighter. In her smile, he saw proof that even in moments of chaos, humanity could shine through. And change was always possible. Months had passed since the day Emily ran crying to Marcus, and while the neighborhood no longer buzzed with constant talk of the incident, its impact continued to shape lives in quiet but profound ways. For Marcus, the changes were subtle yet significant. He noticed more smiles as he drove his garbage truck down familiar streets. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now greeted him warmly, calling him by name instead of referring to him simply as the garbage man. Some even invited him to community events, a block party here, a holiday gathering there. Though he remained humble, Marcus couldn't deny the sense of belonging that began to take root. Emily's transformation was even more striking. With her newfound confidence, she became a beacon of positivity at school. The bullying hadn't disappeared overnight, but Emily learned how to stand up for herself without resorting to anger or retaliation. When classmates teased her, she responded with calm assertiveness, often disarming them with kindness rather than confrontation. Her teachers marveled at her growth, noting how she encouraged others to join her kindness club. What started as a small group of friends handing out uplifting notes soon grew into a school-wide initiative, complete with posters, assemblies, and partnerships with local charities. Sarah, too, experienced a shift in perspective. She made it a priority to be present, not just physically, but emotionally. For Emily, their evenings together became sacred moments filled with laughter, stories, and shared dreams. Sarah also joined the Parent-Teacher Association, advocating for programs that promoted inclusivity and mental health awareness. At work, she pushed for policies allowing employees flexible hours so they could spend more time with their families. These efforts weren't always easy, but seeing Emily thrive made every challenge worth it. As for the broader community, the incident sparked lasting change. Conversations about bias and empathy didn't fade after the initial media attention. Instead, they evolved into ongoing dialogues. Local leaders organized workshops on diversity and inclusion, inviting experts to help residents reflect on their own assumptions and behaviors. Schools implemented anti-bullying campaigns inspired by Emily's story, teaching students the power of compassion and understanding. Even Mrs. Henderson found herself attending these sessions, slowly shedding layers of prejudice she hadn't realized she carried. One crisp autumn morning, almost exactly a year after the incident, Marcus drove his truck down the same street where everything had unfolded. As he stepped out to collect bins, he noticed something different. Where once there had been indifference or suspicion, there were now friendly faces. Children waved enthusiastically from bus stops, and parents exchanged warm greetings as they walked their dogs. It wasn't perfect. There would always be room for growth, but the atmosphere felt lighter, more connected. At the end of his route, Marcus spotted Emily waiting for him near her mailbox. She held a brightly colored sign that read, "Thank you, Marcus," in bold letters, surrounded by hand-drawn hearts and flowers. Behind her stood Sarah, Mr. Patel, and several other neighbors, all clapping softly as Marcus approached. "We wanted to say thank you," Emily said, beaming up at him. "You helped me when I needed it most, and because of you, our neighborhood is better." Marcus chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck self-consciously. "I didn't do anything special," he replied modestly, but his eyes betrayed his emotions, glistening with gratitude and pride. For someone who had spent years feeling invisible, this moment was overwhelming in the best possible way. That evening, as Marcus sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on how far things had come. Change hadn't happened overnight. It had been messy, uncomfortable, and imperfect, but it had happened. People had listened, learned, and grown. And though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, Marcus felt hopeful. After all, if one act of kindness could spark such a transformation, imagine what countless others could achieve. In the distance, laughter echoed through the streets, a sound that reminded him why he kept showing up, day after day. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. And sometimes, that was enough.